and welcome to another video. I'm at the river, as I'm sure you can hear. It's very loud because we've just had all the snow melt and all the ice melt, so the river's extra swollen. It's the winter, so you might think that there's not really much about in terms of useful plants and fungi, but there are actually still a lot of resources that are about during the winter, and there are also some resources that become a little bit more easily accessible as well. So we're going to take a slow walk down to our little spot, and I'm going to just pick out the resources that I personally find useful, especially at this time of year, and I'll give you a little bit of an explanation as to why they're useful and what I tend to use them for. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is this tree here. Now this is a hazel tree, and you can tell that it's hazel because if you look at the base you can see that it's been coppiced at some point in its lifetime, and when hazel is coppiced it tends to produce these really long, very straight sapling kind of shoots. You can see that. So obviously you can't really use the leaves to identify this because it's the winter, so the leaves are all shriveled up and it's quite difficult to tell what they are. But if you have a closer look at the bark, you'll see it's grey and it has these almost like little sort of dark browny black sort of dots or dashes across the bark, and also it tends to grow very straight as well. Close up of the bark there, you can see these sort of not quite pits but sort of markings on the bark there. Now obviously hazel is awesome because it produces the hazel nut, which I'm sure everybody already knows about, but during the winter it becomes very easily accessible, and there are a couple of different bushcraft applications for hazel. So traditionally it was used to build fences because it's flexible and weavable. You can also use the very small sapling shoots like this to make these shafts of arrows, and if you get a reasonable sized sapling in the winter time you can also twist that sapling to create something which is called a withy, which is a form of cordage. But I'm not going to demonstrate that because there's not really anything around that's suitable. Hazel is very flexible, so it can also be used to make a longbow, and it can also be used as the baseboard or as the spindle in a friction fire set as well. So there's plenty of hazel in this woodland, as you can see, but at the base of this is an old birch, and on that birch is a mushroom. Now this is called a birch polypore. These are available all year round, but they just become a little bit easier to spot in the winter. This is a very mature example. Sometimes you find them on the branches just as these tiny little, almost like white blobs. You can identify the birch polypore by this sort of hard leathery brown surface. It's a shelf fungus. It also only grows on dead birch, and it has like a spongy layer instead of gills. It has like a spongy pore surface. The birch polypore is a really interesting mushroom because even though it's not strictly edible as is, you can dry this mushroom out and then rehydrate it and use it to create a tea, which is good for sort of coughs, cold and flu-like symptoms. And from a more sort of primitive bushcraft application, you can also sharpen your knife on this surface once it's dried hard because it dries like leather. So it's also nicknamed the razor strop fungus. And lastly, if you find a young fungus, then you can actually slice off a layer and you can actually use a sliced layer of the mushroom as a band-aid because it's naturally adhesive. Spotted something else that is really interesting. That cool little mushroom is called witch's butter, which is edible. You can add it to soups and things like that, but I'm not going to pick any because I don't fancy it actually. Everybody knows what this is. This is blackberry vine. This is something else that is also still available in the winter months. You're looking for the really young, early bright green leaves off of this plant because you can actually use those in a tea. Now, when you're walking around in the woods and you are looking for resources, a lot of people tend to look either at the trees around them or they look down at the ground, which is fair enough. But instead of just looking at the ground or identifying the trees, you can also have a look and see what you can actually find on the trees as well, or suspended from them. So here is an example of a really useful resource that is available all year round, but again is really easy to spot in the winter just because it's not covered with foliage or leaves that can obstruct it and make it difficult to spot. This here, I believe, is a honeysuckle vine, and you can identify the honeysuckle vine by its sort of papery thin bark that comes off in strips, and it's kind of similar to clematis vine, which also has a bark that comes off in strips, but clematis vine also tends to have these sort of almost like ridge, sort of nodular sections on it, whereas this is pretty much completely smooth. Now this is another one that can be really useful for your friction fires. So you can use clematis vine, and obviously you can use this honeysuckle vine here, and also ivy, which is another vine. You can use all three of those vines for the baseboard of a hand drill set, which is really cool. And the papery bark that comes off the vine can also be rubbed between your fingers, fluffed up, and used as a tinder to help you light your fire. The smaller sections are also really good for weaving, as long as they are not dead, because obviously if they're dead then they'll just snap clean off. The small dead pieces that snap clean off are also really good for helping you start a fire as well. So this vine will give you your tinder, which is the bit that you'll actually use to take the spark or the ember, and then it gives you your first stage of kindling as well, which is the smallest piece of fuel that you would actually use to light your fire. So, all the snow has pretty much melted, and it rained last night as well, all night, so this is all pretty damp, but that's okay. A little bit of preparation and I'm sure we'll be able to start a fire with it. So I've been storing this honeysuckle bark in my little pocket just to help it dry off, keep it close to my body, and I've also gone ahead and collected some small honeysuckle twigs and some slightly larger ones as well. So we're going to light this entire fire just off the damp honeysuckle. Right, so we've got our honeysuckle bark. Get that in the rock, and let's see if we can get this lit. It's going to be very smoky, remember, because everything is damp. Very smoky. So another plant that is really, really easy to spot in the winter is this nice little edible down here. Sheltered underneath this log is this little, almost looks like a giant clover with heart-shaped leaves, and this is wood sorrel. So wood sorrel is an interesting find in the winter because it is a wild edible. You can just pick it and eat it as is. It's got like a sort of lemony, almost sour apple kind of taste to it. There are plenty of edible plants and fungi that can be found in the woods at this time of year in the winter. But I brought some vegetables and some bits and bobs with me, so I'm not actually going to pick anything because I don't need to. And if you don't need it, don't take it. Another really good useful plant to know, which is also available all year round and so is still available in the winter, is something that you probably already know, and I'm just going to then show you because there's loads of it over here. Now this awesome stuff down here is known as sphagnum moss, and it has antiseptic, antibacterial properties. It can be used to dress wounds, and it's also really good for washing your hands with, because it acts like a sponge, but I tend to use it when I'm in the field to just clean off my tools. It's also nice and soft, so it can be used to line beds for natural shelters as well, although because it retains so much moisture, you might find that if you use only moss for your bed, you'll get very wet. So you can use it as a base layer, and then you can line the top of your bed with something like dry materials like grasses or pine boughs, things like that, spruce boughs. Okay, well there you have it. Just a super quick video talking about a couple of different plants that you can still spot in the winter, and also their uses as well. If you like what you see and would like to see more videos from me, be sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment, etc. But yeah, that's all I've got time for, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the woods.